Welcome and thank you for joining us for an update on the Maine Logger Health and Safety Study. This presentation is a compilation between Liane Hirabayashi, Senior Research Coordinator, and myself, Erika Scott, Principal Investigator at the Northeast Center for Occupational Health and Safety and Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishing. Let's get started. This research focuses on logging, injury, and illness in the state of Maine. And we're interested in this because we know that nationally, logging has the highest fatality rate of any civilian occupation. However, what we don't know is regionally how that differs beyond what's available through the Survey of Occupational Injury and Illness and other data from the Department of Labor and insurance companies, perhaps. So we focused on Maine because they have the largest logging workforce in the Northeast. Our study has three specific aims. The first is really understanding logging injury surveillance systems better. The second is focusing on conducting a total worker health assessment of the workforce. And then third, we'd like to identify what injuries and illnesses and worker health are impacting loggers and how can we improve that in the future. This study enrolled a total of 393 loggers in the state of Maine. Enrollment was completed between spring of 2018 and spring of 2019 using several different methods, combining telephone calls, paper surveys, and in-person recruitment. Of these 393, the analysis presented here today focuses on 325 of those loggers, 79 of which are conventional, meaning that they log with a chainsaw and a skidder perhaps, and 246 of them being mechanized loggers, and those two were either cut to length or whole tree harvesting. As you see on the map, the loggers are spread all across the state of Maine, and we're very pleased with the geographic dispersion of the cohort. In addition, almost 200 companies are represented within this cohort, which is very nice for generalizability across the state of Maine. Not surprisingly, 99% of our cohort is men. There are a few women that are involved. However, the industry overwhelmingly is still a male-dominated industry. So the whole study consists of two parts. One is a series of surveys on a quarterly basis, and the other is the health assessment, which happens in person, of course. This particular presentation will focus on the initial survey, and we'll talk a little bit about the health assessment. So for that initial survey and some of the subsequent surveys, we do capture data on what the logger spends time doing in the past quarter, and as well as what types of safety training have they received, personal protective equipment information, as well as health questions. So understanding, have they had a checkup? Have they seen a health specialist? Do they have health insurance? Do they have workers' compensation insurance? And a variety of other topics, but this is just to give you a quick overview. For the health assessment, it's a combination of a health screening questionnaire that the loggers fill out when we are seeing them in person. We have a physician or advanced practice clinician joining us for every health screening, and they're getting a rather thorough physical exam. And then the technician screening covers things like physical measures, a hearing screening, cholesterol, glucose, carbon monoxide for smoking assessments. Quite a wide variety of physical measures and data points we're capturing. So this is an example of what the loggers get to take with them when they finish the health assessment. So they get to understand where their values lie within the ranges of normal to abnormal for a given variable. And the loggers found this particularly helpful in understanding some of their health data. In addition, if a logger came to us and did not have health insurance or needed follow-up, we worked with that logger after the health assessment to either connect them to a health navigator in their region to get health insurance or to a local clinic as well. So the yellow stars on this slide represent the places that we had visited in spring of 2019 for health assessments. And we joined up with the Professional Logging Contractors of Maine during their spring training series to provide these health assessments directly at the logging garages, an example you can see on the top right. And we set up a whole clinic inside the garage, and they were allowed to step out of the training and receive the screening and then go back to the training as well. And you'll notice the NICAM NEC mobile clinic in the background where we conducted hearing screenings, and of course, some nice logging equipment in the front. So what did we really find out? Well, a whole lot, and we're still learning even more. The typical Maine logger is 48 years old, has over 20 years of experience in the field, and is working incredibly long days and has an incredibly long commute. The majority of them are mechanized. However, the conventional loggers are still making up a very good contingent of the Maine logging workforce. So things like musculoskeletal disorders, we're looking at injury rates, and health insurance are some primary concerns to start off with. But we'll get into things a little deeper now. So as we mentioned in the beginning, 246 are represented in the mechanized group and 79 in the conventional group. And not surprisingly, some of the conventional loggers more likely to be a small operation, either working by themselves or with a small crew. However, the size of operations really varied within the study. So some operations had more than 50 employees, and the majority between 2 and 10 or 11 and 50. And there's some differences between conventional and mechanized loggers, especially in the use of PPE, and a lot of that is driven by the type of work that they're doing and the risks that they may have. So, for example, a high-vis vest, if they're working in a mechanized logging site, makes you aware and visible to the other folks on the site, whereas if you're a solo logger, maybe you're not wearing as much of a high-vis, for example. And certainly, if you're a mechanized logger, you may not be using chaps as much because you're inside equipment, whereas a conventional logger would be wearing those. So looking here at the continuous outcomes, I'll just bring up some of the more statistically significant ones here. But in general, as we mentioned before, years in logging, they've been doing it for a long time for the most part. There are some newer workers, and they're encouraging folks to enter the industry because as folks retire, they need some sort of fresh blood. But on average, the conventional loggers have a little bit longer work history than the mechanized loggers. And the length of the workday for mechanized loggers is a bit longer, as is the commute time, which again is not surprising based on the type of work that they do. So looking at binary outcomes and highlighting the significant values here, for mechanized loggers starting before 6 a.m., it was quite significantly different. And many of them start at 2:30 in the morning or around there. And a lot of them have hour-and-a-half commutes on average. And then for the safety training, that did vary on the size of the operation and also the interaction between the type of logging and size. Looking at logger injury rates that have been compiled from this initial survey of the study. So our NAC study has an injury rate of 6.8 per 100 full-time equivalent workers, whereas for 2017, the Survey of Occupational Injury and Illness in Maine reported 4.2 per 100 full-time equivalent workers, whereas the national logging data for soy is 2.8. So we're not necessarily surprised by this. I think we did have a great response for this survey, and it's possible that the loggers may have been more apt to report on our survey versus some of the not that they're not reporting, but depending on where soy chose to sample in Maine, that could make certainly a difference. So just to touch on some of the preliminary health screening results. So I've used a green, red, yellow indicator here. So we can see that in many aspects, the logger endpoints have really wonderful endpoints. Their cholesterol on average is quite good. Their glucose values are really great. Really normal heart rates, things like that. Not surprisingly, like many other Americans, body mass index is a red indicator, meaning that they are just edging into the obese category there on average. Of course, not everyone, but on average. And then if we look to the left for the Mallampati scores, so this is an example of how open someone's airway is, that 24% of loggers had a Mallampati class score of 3 or 4, and another 30% had a class 2. So we'll return to this in a little bit later on the presentation, but just keep that in mind. In addition, loggers tended to have elevated blood pressure. And again, this potentially is not surprising. Many Americans have elevated blood pressures. And you can see the normal range, which between 120/80. And you can see the distribution of the dots here, and that many of them for their systolic are a bit high, and even for the dystolic are a bit high. So again, something to pay attention to. So other concerns that came out of the preliminary health screening results, musculoskeletal pain was reported in nearly 40% of the cohort, and that was pretty consistent between mechanized and conventional loggers. We still need to analyze the hearing data. However, there was hearing loss that is observed, and again, for this type of industry, not surprising at all. And we did collect some neurological data from the physicians and the advanced practice clinicians, and that data still needs to be analyzed. So what are we doing next? We continue to conduct the surveys, and we're almost done with our 6th and final follow-up survey. So there'll be a total of 7 surveys that we'll have longitudinal data on. But some things have come out so far in the data that we've seen. And in particular, as we mentioned before, we have the body mass index is a bit of an issue, blood pressure is a bit of an issue, the Mallampati scores, and we also have some neck circumference data, which shows that some of them have an increased uh, measurement there. Between the fact that they are getting up incredibly early, they have very long commutes, and some of the written feedback that we've gotten and verbal feedback, we're looking toward how does sleep deprivation and fatigue influence productivity, and that may be something we're exploring a bit more in the future. So we still need to follow up and do the formal analysis for the longitudinal data trends and maybe look at some seasonal variation across spring, summer, winter, fall. Spring traditionally in Maine is the mud season and they're not logging quite as much. And then we have quite a bit of free text response that we need to go through and code. And as a side project, we undertook a photo voice evaluation about diet and where they can get what types of foods that they eat. So that also will be an intervention. So we continually work with the logging industry to understand what's important to them and how they perceive these data and what they feel as though we should work on next. And we continue to build those partnerships and expand across Maine and the Northeast to make the next project successful. Here's a peek at some of the references that we used. And then lastly, we would of course invite questions. If anyone is interested in this research or wants to learn more in detail, we would certainly welcome an email at our nec.logging@basset.org. Thanks again for joining us today, and take care.